Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, and today I want to talk about some of the most common misconceptions I see about non-binary people. Before I start talking about all the things non-binary people are not, I want to explain who we are. In simplest terms, a non-binary person is anyone whose gender doesn't strictly fit into the categories of man or woman. It's an umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of different experiences with gender, or no gender at all. Alright, let's get into it. Here's a list of 10 things non-binary people are not. Number 1. Non-binary people are not spicy cis. A lot of times, non-binary people are viewed as cis with a little something extra. Cis people who just dress differently. Cis people who reject gender stereotypes or gender roles. The big implication here is that non-binary people are really the gender that they were assigned at birth, and that this non-binary thing isn't actually a gender so much as it is something they've just layered on top like an accessory. And there's a lot of other baggage wrapped up in this that's pretty messed up. One is the conflation of gender with fashion. To dismiss non-binary as just dressing different completely discounts the reason that we might dress the way we do, to affirm and express who we are. Another one is mistaking non-binary for rejecting gender roles. This is often twisted into an argument against our very existence. So we'll hear things like, well, by rejecting gender roles, doesn't that mean you're admitting they exist in the first place? And then doesn't that mean that you're really just helping to uphold them instead of tearing them down? First of all, no, it doesn't mean that. Admitting that gender roles exist doesn't do anything to help uphold them. They exist whether we want them to or not. But also, anyone can reject gender roles. That's not exclusive to non-binary people. And finally, the idea that non-binary people are seen as spicy cis means that we're not seen as trans, which gets into a whole other issue that I'll be addressing in the next point. All of this stems from the fact that non-binary people are viewed through a cis-binary-centric lens. We're shoved into one of these two boxes of man and woman all the time, and we have to make the best of living within that framework. So that can come across to people like we are spicy cis, but that's not actually who we are. Non-binary people are not assigned non-binary at birth. So by default, that means none of us are cis, spicy, bland, or otherwise. Number 2, non-binary people are not trans lite. You know how I said the perception of non-binary as spicy cis means that we're not seen as trans? Yeah, time to talk about the other side of that coin. Just a little recap on terminology. Transgender means that your gender is different from the one you were assigned at birth based on your sex. And because non-binary people aren't assigned non-binary at birth, that makes all of us trans by definition. Some non-binary people don't consider themselves trans, and that's totally okay. Maybe you feel like the word trans implies transitioning in a way that doesn't really match what you're doing. Maybe you feel like you're not a part of the trans cis-binary any more than you're part of the man-woman one. Whatever the reason, if you're non-binary, you don't have to consider yourself trans if that doesn't fit for you. But you do have a place within the trans community if you wish. Unfortunately, there's a misconception in a lot of trans circles that non-binary doesn't count. Maybe we're sort of trans-ish, maybe we're sort of trans-lite, but we're not like those real people who are making the full journey as a trans woman or a trans man. We're just playing at being trans. We're just trans trenders. Much like some cis people consider us spicy cis, some trans people consider us trans-lite. And that's just as harmful. Perhaps even more so, because it comes from within our own community. There's a misconception that non-binary people don't experience dysphoria or transition, for example, and therefore are not as trans as a binary trans man or trans woman. First of all, that's not true. There are many non-binary people who do transition and who do experience gender dysphoria. Hi, I'm one of them. But more importantly, experiencing dysphoria and the act of transitioning are not what makes someone trans. What makes you trans is if your gender is different from the one you were assigned at birth. That's it. There are some people who don't experience gender dysphoria so much as they experience gender euphoria, and they are still trans. There are some people who can't transition or don't want to transition for whatever reason, medically, socially, or otherwise, and they are also still trans. I think a lot of people sort of misconceptualize non-binary and trans as two completely different categories and different experiences. But they actually are within the same community. Non-binary is considered a type of trans, and there is a lot of overlap. So non-binary doesn't mean trans to a lesser degree, or that you're not fully trans. It's just a different way of being trans. Number 3, non-binary people are not the same as intersex people. This one is just a conflation between sex and gender. Non-binary means that your gender doesn't strictly fit into the categories of man or woman. Intersex means that your physical sex, so your primary or secondary sex characteristics, your chromosomes, your hormones, etc., doesn't fit within the categories of male or female. And note the language I use there. Man, woman, non-binary for gender, male, female, intersex for sex, because sex and gender are two different things. Remember how I said that people are not assigned non-binary at birth? That's because when a baby is born, they're immediately shoved into one of those binary gendered boxes. The doctor will look at what's between their legs and say, it's a boy or it's a girl. And that's still true if the baby is intersex. And that process of shoving these intersex people into one of those two binary categories often results in unnecessary and non-consensual medical procedures, which is something that never should have happened and needs to stop. An intersex person can be any gender. A non-binary person can have any sex characteristics. So that means some intersex people might be non-binary, and some non-binary people might be intersex, but they're not the same thing. One of the reasons people might get non-binary and intersex mixed up, and on a broader scale get sex and gender mixed up, is because Western society is so cis-binary centric, and there's an expectation that your gender is tied to your sex. We can clearly see how this idea is harmful to both the intersex and the trans communities in different ways. Healthcare is a big one. Intersex people are forced into treatments they didn't ask for. Trans people are gate-kept from treatments they need, all in the name of upholding this cis-binary centric system. Sadly, I don't see these two communities banding together as much as I think they should to work on dismantling the system that oppresses us. Instead, what I see is things like trans people using intersex people as a crutch to justify the science behind our own existence, which really just causes unnecessary conflict between our communities. What we really need to focus on is better education. That will help make sure that people don't conflate sex and gender anymore and stop shoving trans and intersex people into these rigid binary boxes. And that way, none of us will have to justify our existence to anyone. We'll just be accepted for the diversity in gender and sex that we represent. Number 4, non-binary people are not a third gender. Non-binary isn't a single gender in and of itself, it's an umbrella term. So instead of a third gender, think of it like a big bucket full of gender experiences. If you're non-binary, your gender might be a mix between man and woman, or something between them. It might be adjacent to manhood or womanhood, but still not strictly fit within either of those categories. That's why I'll sometimes hear someone describe themselves as a non-binary woman or a non-binary man. Or your gender might not have anything to do with manhood or womanhood at all. In that sense, it's better to think of gender not so much as a spectrum or a continuum, but as a galaxy. Maybe your gender is something unique to you. Maybe you don't have a gender at all. Maybe you have multiple genders. Maybe your gender fluctuates. Maybe you don't know exactly how to define or describe your gender. These are just a few of the many, many ways that you could be non-binary. There are lots of terms out there that describe different types of non-binary experiences, such as genderqueer, agender, bigender, gender fluid, demigender. The list goes on and on. And if a label for your gender doesn't exist, or you don't feel like you fit with any of the ones that are out there, that's okay. In fact, that's how a lot of new labels get coined. And you don't have to feel pressured to use a label at all if you don't want to. There's been a recent surge in non-binary people feeling frustrated that we're seen more and more as a single third gender. That as Western society is becoming more aware of our existence, they're treating it like a gender trinary, which is just as limiting in a lot of ways as a gender binary. The reality is that non-binary encompasses a vast variety of experiences. We're not a monolith, we're not all alike, and we're not just one third gender. We're an extremely diverse community. Number 5, non-binary people are not all androgynous. Let's talk about two different aspects of gender: identity and expression. Gender identity is about who you are, and gender expression is about how you present yourself. And those two things may or may not line up. But why not? I mean, isn't gender expression supposed to be about how you show the outside world what your gender is inside? Well, it can, but not necessarily. For example, a woman who rocks a short haircut, doesn't wear makeup, and shops in the men's section could be said to have a masculine gender expression, but her gender identity is still a woman. So her gender identity and expression in that case don't match. Whereas if a man walked through the door dressed and groomed exactly the same as that woman, same haircut, same clothing, same lack of makeup, you would say that his masculine gender expression does match his gender identity as a man. This is super oversimplified, by the way. There's a whole lot more nuance to both gender identity and expression than I could include in that example, but I just wanted to give you the basic idea. For trans people, the relationship between gender identity and gender expression tends to be a little more complicated than it is for cis people. That's because our gender expression is heavily scrutinized by others and plays a role in helping to get us gendered correctly. There are expectations for what men and women are supposed to look like, and if physical characteristics of your body don't match that, there's an expectation that you should bridge the gap through your gender expression. More often than not, trans people have to overcompensate with our gender expression to have our gender identity respected. So let's go back to our example about the woman whose gender expression is masculine. If she's cis, then she may get called a tomboy or butch, but she will still ultimately be seen as a woman. But if she's trans, she's likely to be misgendered, and that's an unfair double standard that exists between trans and cis people. So if you're non-binary and you want to be respected as such, what does that mean for your gender expression? First of all, it is really hard to be seen as non-binary at all because, like I mentioned earlier, people will immediately try to shove you into that man or woman box. But if you even want a shot at it, there's an expectation that you have to look sufficiently androgynous. Here's the thing though, just like not every woman wants to present as feminine and not every man wants to present as masculine, not every non-binary person wants to present as androgynous, but a lot of people still expect non-binary folks to look androgynous and will even use the terms non-binary and androgynous interchangeably. Even worse, society's definition of androgynous is really narrow. And I mean like literally narrow, because one of the expectations is that you're so thin with, no muscles or curves enough that people can't really tell what's going on with your body or get a read on your gender. The stereotypical androgynous look also includes things like short hair, no facial or body hair, angular features, boxy or shapeless clothing, and being able-bodied and white for some reason. Celebrity examples who might come to mind are David Bowie, Annie Lennox, or Tilda Swinton. It is really, really hard to fit into that specific standard of androgyny. So even if a non-binary person wants to look androgynous, they might not be able to do it, at least not in the socially accepted way. And regardless, a non-binary person shouldn't have to look androgynous enough to be gendered correctly or treated with respect. Number 6, non-binary people are not theys. In recent years, there's been a growing awareness of the use of they, them as singular personal pronouns. A lot of people who use they, them pronouns are non-binary. And because the non-binary community and the use of they, them pronouns are starting to gain a little bit more visibility, people have conflated the two. This has resulted in popular internet slang such as girls, gays, and theys, or theydies and gentle thems as more inclusive alternatives to the classic ladies and gentlemen, and you also see a lot of memes and posts that describe non-binary folks as theys. This is mostly just harmless fun, and I do want to say that the spirit of inclusivity is a great thing and a sign of progress. But it does point to that conflation between non-binary people and they-them pronouns. And just as not all non-binary people are androgynous, not all non-binary people use they-them pronouns. I make that comparison just because pronouns can be considered a part of gender expression. Although pronouns can play a big role in affirming your gender, they're not the same thing as gender itself. Pronouns have gendered associations in society. He/him pronouns are considered masculine, she/her pronouns are considered feminine, they/them pronouns are considered neutral, but there's no requirement that all men have to use he/him, all women have to use she/her, or all non-binary people have to use they/them. You can use whatever pronouns fit you best. And yes, for a lot of non-binary people, those pronouns are they/them, but not for all of us. Some non-binary people use he/him, hello, she/her, it/its, neopronouns, multiple sets of pronouns, no pronouns, names only. The sky's the limit. For some of us, myself included actually, they/them pronouns can even feel wrong. For me personally, something about the neutral context of they/them feels very genderless, and I feel very genderful, so they/them pronouns aren't a good fit for me and I don't use them. Even so, a lot of people, especially online, will use they/them pronouns for me because they know I'm non-binary, and that association between non-binary and they/them is so strong. I know people do this with nothing but the best of intentions, but it does make me wish that that conflation between non-binary and they/them pronouns didn't exist, because it does result in me getting called the wrong pronoun sometimes. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Bottom line, calling all non-binary people theys is a misrepresentation at best and misgendering at worst. Non-binary people can use any pronouns, so the most respectful thing to do is to find out what those pronouns are for each individual non-binary person you meet. Number 7. Non-binary people are not all assigned female at birth. For some reason, there's this idea that non-binary people started out as women who then wanted to escape the confines of misogyny, so they just decided to go off and be a different gender or something. That's not how that works. Gender isn't a choice. This is an offshoot of the spicy cis narrative specific to the woman side of the gender binary. And it's why we so often see non-binary people lumped in with women for the sake of inclusivity, in a way that we don't see them lumped in with men. Online events or Twitter hashtags designed to be a place for women to share and promote their work will often say something like, "Non-binary people, feel free to participate too." There are community support groups and meetups for women and non-binary people. A lot of us even get shoutouts on International Women's Day, as if we don't already have a non-binary people's day. There are two big problems with the assumption that all non-binary people are AFAB. One is that lumping us in with women based on our assumed assigned gender can feel really invalidating. Even though it's meant to be inclusive, the actual result is misgendering AFAB non-binary people as women. When we hear women say, "Oh, you're close enough, you totally count, you're one of us," that implies something about the way those women see us that doesn't feel too great. And it's hard not to think of it as kind of a slippery slope toward that particular brand of radical feminism that sees us as lost sisters to bring back to the fold. The other, more obvious problem, of course, is that not all non-binary people are AFAB. A lot of non-binary people were assigned male at birth, or AMAB, and they get swept under the rug as a result of this assumption. For example, if someone sets up a space or a meetup for women and non-binary people, often what they actually mean is women and AFAB non-binary people. So if an AMAB non-binary person shows up, particularly one whose gender expression isn't feminine, there's a chance that that person will be turned away because they look too masculine for this women's safe space, even though that space was advertised for women and non-binary people. So that attempt at inclusivity ends up not being so inclusive after all. When non-binary people are assumed to be AFAB, it means AFAB non-binary folks get misgendered, AMAB non-binary folks get excluded or drastically misrepresented in society, and none of us are actually seen as non-binary. We're just reduced back to our assigned genders at birth. Spicy sis, am I right? Number 8. Non-binary people are not new. Because awareness of non-binary people is still pretty recent in Western society, there's an assumption that it's a new thing that's just popped up out of nowhere. It's a fad, it's a trend. All the cool kids are doing it, right? The gender binary is presented as a given, a fact of life. Even if we don't fit into that binary, we learn it, we grow up in it, we're steeped in it. It permeates so many aspects of our culture so heavily that it's almost impossible to imagine a world without it. But not every society conceives of gender in that way. There are cultures all around the world. In Mexico, Polynesia, Thailand, India, indigenous cultures across North America, and many, many other places, with systems that recognize more than two genders. European colonization has unfortunately imposed the gender binary on a lot of cultures, which can make it seem ubiquitous, but it is clearly not universal. Not only that, but even in Western society where the binary is very prevalent, there have still always been people who didn't fit within it. If you look back throughout history, you'll find people like Claude Cahun, the Mappa, or the public universal friend, just to name a few. The reason people might think non-binary is a new concept is because even though we've always existed, it's only recently that we've begun to develop significant language around our experiences. Earlier I mentioned they/them pronouns, and while those have been in use as singular pronouns since the 1300s in English, it wasn't until the early 2000s that they started coming into use as singular personal pronouns, often to affirm non-binary gender. It also wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that we even saw words like genderqueer and non-binary start to come into use. And the language around gender variance is still evolving quite a lot, even today in 2021. So even though non-binary may seem like a new or unfamiliar concept to those of you outside the community, we've always been here. We've just been growing our language, building our community, and making ourselves more widely known over the last few decades. Number 9. Non-binary people are not making it up. Non-binary? That's not a thing. You don't need different pronouns, you just need therapy. Oh, you want to identify as some gender that doesn't exist? Well, fine. I identify as an attack helicopter. These are all things non-binary people have heard many, many times before from those who want to discount our existence. This just stems, again, from that cis-binary-centric system I've been talking about, where people are raised to think there are only two genders, your real gender is the gender you were assigned at birth, and anyone who says otherwise must be lying. But gender isn't a choice. And those of us in the trans community, whether trans men, trans women, or non-binary, are not making our genders up. We're simply acknowledging what we feel. We're well aware that we live in a transphobic society. So do you really think we would make up or choose something that would get us so heavily ostracized? You don't have to believe what we're telling you, of course. If non-binary sounds too far-fetched for you, don't worry, nobody's gonna get into your brain and try to police your thoughts. But what I urge you to consider is how those thoughts inform your actions, and how your actions impact non-binary people's lives. For example, the assumption that non-binary genders, or being trans in general, is a mental illness is not only misinformed, but actively harmful. Many people, including minors, are put through conversion therapy to try to cure any signs that they show of gender nonconformity. Numerous human rights organizations and medical associations have denounced conversion therapy as cruel and inhumane, but unfortunately it remains legal in many parts of the world. So it's a really damaging practice, and telling non-binary or any other trans people that we need therapy to cure our mental illness contributes to that damage. Instead of dismissing us, a more helpful approach is being open-minded and willing to learn. Just because you've never heard of non-binary before doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Think about it this way. If an elementary school kid has never heard of nuclear physics or calculus, does that mean those subjects don't exist? Of course not. It just means the kid hasn't learned them yet. If you were raised in the binary, then non-binary might be a difficult concept for you to wrap your mind around, and that's okay. You can learn and grow more over time. And you don't have to fully understand something in order to respect it. A person's gender is a core part of who they are. And if that doesn't deserve respect, what does? Number 10. Non-binary people are not visible. This may seem like a bit of an odd point to make after all the other parts of this video where I've talked about the growing awareness of non-binary people. But by and large, we are still invisible in a lot of ways. Most of us can't get legal documentation, birth certificates, driver's licenses, social security cards, passports, etc., that actually list our gender marker as non-binary. Dress codes for schools, businesses, and social events like weddings often have guidance for men and women but don't say anything about non-binary people. Most public bathrooms or locker rooms are either for men or women. Many forms list man and woman as the only gender options, forcing us to misgender ourselves when we have to fill them out. There's not really a place for us in sports besides the rare few that are co-ed. In healthcare, many things are framed as men's health or women's health, rather than categorized by body part without any gender attached. Trans healthcare is treated as a niche interest in much of the medical community, and non-binary is an even smaller niche within that. If non-binary folks can't access the gender-affirming healthcare that we need through an informed consent model, we often have to lie about our gender identities to get access to things like hormones and surgeries that we may need. In English, most of our social language is heavily gendered in a way that doesn't include or often even acknowledge non-binary people's existence. And this is more pronounced the more formal you get. Audiences are addressed as ladies and gentlemen. Customers are addressed as ma'am or sir. We always hear about the brave men and women in our armed forces, but never about the brave non-binary people who serve too. Are there exceptions to this? Of course. I've used gender-neutral bathrooms in public before. I've filled out a few electronic forms that gave me more options than just man or woman, and when it's a paper form, I always write non-binary in. I've seen non-binary inclusive language in the occasional policy or article. But like I said, these have all been exceptions, and they're much too few and far between. These efforts at inclusivity tend to be more common in queer-friendly spaces and in large cities, which leaves out non-binary folks elsewhere. And even then, sometimes they might be just performative for fake woke points, like when people ask for your pronouns on a form but then continue to misgender you anyway. If we want a truly equal society, we have to start giving the same consideration to non-binary people as we give to men and women. So how does visibility help with that? Well, the more people see us, the more they'll learn about us and start to understand us, and that will help them realize how important it is to include us. So educate yourself and do what you can to help educate others. And when you have the opportunity to do so, it can go a long way to just remind others that we exist. The non-binary community is trying really hard to make sure we're seen so that we can be treated equally. But we can't do it on our own. We need your help. And that wraps up our list of 10 things non-binary people are not. I hope you learned a lot from this video. I hope it cleared up any misconceptions or misunderstandings that you might have had. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those down below. I would really love to start a discussion about this. And if you're non-binary and people have made these kind of mistaken assumptions about you, whether it's some of the ones in the video or some different ones, please feel free to share that in the comments as well. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any new videos that I put out. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, and I also have some cosplay music videos and makeup tutorials that you can watch while you're here. If you want to find me on other social media, I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you on the next one.